welcome back to another English 101 video. So the first major paper that you're going to write for me is a rhetorical analysis paper. Now, if we're going to talk about rhetorical analysis, we've got to talk about rhetoric. And if we're going to talk about rhetoric, we have to talk about our good friend Aristotle, who got all this started way back in the 4th century BCE. While that is obviously quite a long time ago, a lot of the ideas that he developed about persuasive texts are still valid today, right? And of course, Greece was the first great democracy, and so of course it was a powerful thing for Aristotle to explore and understand how successful arguments work, because indeed rhetoric is how things get done in democracies. Right? In totalitarian societies, things get done by force. The people in charge tell you what to do, and you do it. In democracies, we the people discuss what we want in the public forum. We discuss it with our legislators, who in turn discuss it amongst themselves. This is how change happens in democracies. All right? And so that's why I like to think of rhetoric as the words that change the world. Now, I mentioned the word text a minute ago, but keep in mind that when we talk about rhetorical texts, we are not talking about textbooks or even just things that are just written. When we talk about written rhetoric, it can be things that are spoken, like speeches. Think of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington, or one of JFK's famous speeches. These are forms of oral rhetoric, right? Written rhetoric is opinionated articles you might read online, also called op-eds. You're going to choose one of 3 op-eds to analyze in your rhetorical analysis paper. More on that in a little bit. And you can also have multimodal rhetoric, which is arguments that involve both words and images. So really, literally, any billboard that you see as you're driving to campus is going to be multimodal rhetoric. It's persuasive text that's designed to try to get you to buy the thing, right? Rhetoric is always designed to connect with the audience and persuade them to see things the way that the author or rhetor sees them. And usually, almost always really, these things are underpinned by some kind of rhetorical exigence or problem, right? And the author uses the rhetoric to communicate with the audience about the problem, to potentially change how they see it, spark discussion, and possibly take action. So you can see why this was important, particularly in the civil rights movement in the 60s, because it was a nonviolent approach. And so indeed, communication was the most important tool that was used, right? Of course, rhetoric in advertising in those billboards is a little bit more straightforward. They see the problem is that you haven't bought the thing yet, so they will convince you why you need to buy the thing. Isn't that fascinating how that works? So when you think about it, there's lots of different problems that our democracy faces that we have to grapple with and figure out. And we figure these things out through discussion, right? And so in order for me to have you write about rhetoric, we have to look at rhetoric that's associated with a specific issue, right? And so this semester, the issue that you're going to be writing about is censorship on social media. In the past, I used to have students write about chronic traumatic encephalopathy in the NFL. So actually the sample paper has to do with that. Everything else is the same. The topic is just different, but it's still a good example of an effective rhetorical analysis paper. But don't worry if you haven't read a lot about censorship on social media. I've chosen some great readings to help you kind of understand that discussion, so that when you choose one of those articles you write about, you can analyze it from an informed perspective. More on that later. And of course, what is rhetorical analysis? It is a way to evaluate how an argument works. It's not telling me whether you agree or disagree with it. it is telling me how is the argument created, how does it use logos, ethos, and pathos. More on that in the next slide. But lots of English instructors have assignments like this, and the idea is that if you have a better understanding of how arguments work, then down the road when you're asked to create your own arguments, you'll do a better job of it. And indeed, in the second major paper of the term, you'll write your own op-ed for me about a completely different topic. And the work that you do understanding how arguments work in this paper will help. So remember, the purpose of your paper is analysis. We're not looking for persuasive writing here. I don't want you to take a side and try to convince your reader to agree with your own viewpoint on censorship and social media. No. When you get further through the module, when you get to the rhetorical analysis paper instructions, you're going to see you have 3 different articles to choose from, and you're going to analyze one of them. You'll choose one and explain how their argument works. And whenever you're analyzing something, you have to look closely at the individual parts. If you're explaining how an engine works, you're not going to tell me whether you think it's the best engine or not. You're explaining how the individual parts work. You can do this in other classes with art, films, poetry, but this is English class, and so we're going to talk about how an argument works, how the argument works in whichever article you chose. That's rhetorical analysis. So to do this, you have to think about rhetorical considerations. Who is the target audience that the author is trying to reach? How are they hoping to change their mind? What's the purpose? And you also have to think about the rhetorical appeals: logos, ethos, and pathos. Now, there are many, many other rhetorical appeals that Aristotle identified. These are just the 3 kind of most prominent ones, I think, and the easiest ones to write about. I mean, you could choose any piece of rhetoric you find, and they will have examples of each of these appeals in that rhetoric. It's kind of fascinating. But of course, remember, the words are funny because they're Greek. They're from Aristotle. But don't let that intimidate you. You have to use these words in the paper. If you're going to write about how the author uses logos, you have to use the word logos. What are appeals to logos? Authors appeal to logos when they try to use reasoning to persuade their audience, when they try to use numbers or specific examples or definitions. Let's pretend that I wrote an article for the newspaper where I try to convince people that texting and driving is terrible and should be banned nationwide. In that article, I might point to statistics about how many people die because of distracted driving. I might point to facts about how it's been proven to be physically impossible to split your attention between the phone and the road. You can switch back and forth quickly, but you cannot truly split your attention. Or I could give specific examples of where distracted driving led to accidents. All of those are examples of appeals to logos, using reasoning to persuade the reader to agree with me that it should be banned nationwide. Now, interestingly enough, of course, logos-based appeals are important. Most readers intuitively understand they want to see some facts to convince them of things. However, if we don't trust the reader or the writer or the speaker, we're not going to listen. And that's why appeals to ethos are important. This has to do with credibility. So, for example, if there were 2 opinionated articles in a newspaper about texting and driving, and one was written by me, and one was written by the person who is the head of the Arizona Department of Transportation, who has more credibility to write about that topic? The person who's the head of ADOT, not me. I may know a lot about that topic, but my field is English composition and creative writing. not the Arizona Department of Transportation. So that person has much more credibility to write about texting and driving than I do, right? And so any article that you look at is almost always, if it's published online or in print, it's almost always going to have what's called a byline. This is where I'll just show you one because I use this example in the discussion board that you'll get to later. This is one of the articles that you might get to choose to read about. But if you look at the bottom, you can see this is a byline where it tells you information about the writer. Most mainstream periodicals always include bylines because they want you to see that the people that are writing for them are credible. And so that's an appeal to ethos. And you can think about, well, when you write about ethos, you can think about what is it about each of these things that makes the author credible. And then authors can also do things within the article itself to build their credibility. They can show they understand the other side. They can cite experts. They can and do things like that. That helps build the reader's trust of them and their credibility. Because again, readers won't listen to facts unless they trust the speaker or author. That leaves us the last one we're going to talk about, which is appeals to pathos. Appeals to pathos are emotional appeals. So the idea is that you need facts to convince the reader. You need them to, the writer needs them to trust them, the writer. But emotional appeals tend to help readers remember things. They want to feel like they're connecting with an article, right? And so, for example, let's go back to the same example we're using. If I write an article where I'm trying to convince you that texting and driving should be banned nationwide, maybe I include in there an example where I talk about this woman whose child was killed by someone who was updating their Facebook post and ran them over. And perhaps I use words that inspire an emotional response, right? Where I talk about how terrified the child must have been when this happened, or I talk about how just grief-stricken and distraught the mother was when she found out. That's an appeal to pathos. That's designed to kind of get the reader's attention and to get them to connect with the argument. Arguments shouldn't just consist of appeals to pathos. There should be some facts in there, but the emotion-based appeals are things that are designed to get you to kind of pay attention, either because of fear that you feel, anger, sadness, or amusement. So here's the key. When you're looking for appeals to pathos in an article that you're analyzing, look for specific words or phrases that are designed to make you, the reader, feel a certain way. If you feel angry, sad, or fearful when you read a specific part of something, try to figure out what word made you feel that way and why does the author want you to feel that way. That's how you do effective writing about appeals to pathos. All three of the articles that I've given you to choose from have multiple examples of each of these rhetorical appeals. There's no right or wrong article to choose. That's the neat thing about rhetorical analysis, because almost any opinionated article we pick out there is going to have some elements of each of these appeals. Keep in mind, too, that the Venn diagram is probably not an appropriate choice on my part here, because some articles rely more heavily on logos than on pathos, or vice versa, where you may have an article that has lots of persuasive facts, but the author is not as credible as another author. It's kind of fascinating. But again, the idea is that when you do a rhetorical analysis, this is how the argument works, is by invoking these different appeals to try to convince the reader to agree with the writer's viewpoint. I'm going to end the video here so that you can move forward in the modules and do some more readings about the rhetorical appeals, and then go ahead and check out the instructions for the rhetorical analysis paper, and also get into a quiz and a discussion board and some other great stuff. That's all I've got. Thanks for watching.